All right, today we're going to walk through a visual documentation of a method called market DNA. We'll be looking at a specific case study, a live cycle in the S&P 500 to see how it's all laid out. Let's dive in. So what exactly is market DNA? Well, at its core, it's described as a proprietary geometric system. And an important note from its creators, this analysis is being documented out in the open for public verification.
And hey, if you want to check out the official source documentation for yourself, that's the place to go. The website is right there on the screen.
Okay, so here's the plan for this breakdown. First, we'll get a handle on the market DNA framework itself. Then, we'll jump right into that S&P 500 case study. We'll look at Phase 1, that's the entry and planning. Then we'll see a key event that took place in Phase 3. And finally, we'll check in on where the cycle stands right now. All right, let's start with the basics. The market DNA framework. The big idea here is that it's a visual system, and everything is organized into distinct phases. So you might be wondering what makes this thing tick. It's defined as a proprietary and geometric system. But what's really interesting, according to the documentation, is what it doesn't use. We're talking no traditional technical analysis, no fundamental analysis, and no quantitative indicators. It's a completely different approach.
The whole system really boils down to 4 key phases. You've got Phase 1, the entry, which is where the plan is made. Phase 2 is called mirror contact. Then there's Phase 3, the end-level event, a key target. And finally, Phase 4, which is completion at the trapezoid top. But here's a little twist. The documentation points out that these phases don't always happen in a neat 1, 2, 3, 4 order.
Okay, now that we have the basic framework down, let's see it in action. We're diving into the case study, a live cycle playing out in the S&P 500.
So, the asset we're tracking is the S&P 500 index, and for documentation purposes, this particular cycle has a specific ID, SP500_3_3.
All right, let's get into the nitty-gritty. Phase 1, entry and planning. This is the initial setup, the blueprint, if you will. For the record, this was all laid out on February 5th, 2026.
So here's what the chart looked like right at the start of Phase 1. You can see these geometric shapes laid right over the price action, specifically what the model calls triangle 3 and the larger trapezoid. And right there, within that structure, the system flagged 2 potential entry points, labeled M and PC.
The first one, the primary entry level, is M. That was set at $6,831.25. But there was also a plan B, a secondary entry level called PC, which was pegged at $6,761.14. And this isn't just a random second chance. The documentation is clear that this is a built-in part of the system's risk management. Now, this is where it gets really specific. Before anything even happens, the risk parameters are all laid out. They use a hypothetical scenario. Let's say you start with 100 grand. The system sets a hard stop, a max drawdown of 5%. It also defines other key variables, like the 18-day duration for the trapezoid, and it even calculates the specific trade sizes. So, that naturally leads to the question, how are those trade sizes actually determined? Well, the documentation gives us a very specific answer, and I'm going to read this directly because it's important. Quote, both trade sizes are calculated using the hypothetical capital, the investor's maximum allowed drawdown, the third triangle domain percentage, the risk coefficient, and the contract size. Okay, so based on that whole setup, the model then maps out 2 potential scenarios. In scenario 1, if only that first entry point, M, gets hit, the projected profit is just over $2,300 for an expected annual return of nearly 48%. Now, in scenario 2, if both entry points get triggered, the total expected profit jumps to almost $4,500, and that pushes the expected annual return all the way up over 90%.
So that was the game plan. Now let's see what really happened. We're jumping forward just one day to February 6th to look at the cycle's progression.
And remember how I mentioned the phases don't always go in order? Well, here's a perfect example. In this cycle, things jump straight from Phase 1 to Phase 3, completely skipping over Phase 2 for the time being. So the documented sequence became 1, then 3. And you can see it right here on the chart. The price made a move up and hit what the model calls apex N of triangle 3. When that happens, boom, according to the system's rules, Phase 3 is officially complete. So let's just quickly run through the sequence of events. First, the price triggered the primary trade at level M. Then, it actually dipped, activating that secondary risk management trade at PC.
From there, it rallied all the way up to apex N. Once it hit that specific point, the second position was closed, while the first position, from level M, was left open.
Okay, so that brings us to the present. Where does this life cycle stand right now? Let's take a look at the current status, and then we'll wrap up with some really important disclaimers.
So the documentation kind of leaves us on a cliffhanger. With one position still open and Phase 3 in the books, the big question is, what's next? Is Phase 2 mirror contact the next logical event? The source material simply concludes, we are navigating the market to see what happens next.
And before we finish, it's absolutely crucial we go over the disclaimers provided in the source material. First and foremost, this is not financial advice. The model specifically prohibits using leverage above 10. You're also advised not to invest essential personal funds. Remember, this analysis is presented strictly for public documentation and verification of the model. And finally, any risk management must follow the user's own instructions.